Welcome. I'm here with Gary Machlis. We welcome you to the Vieques Conservation and Historical Trust podcast series for a speaker series where we are working with experts, friends, and people who can share some light on some of the things that are going on in Vieques and the world, coming to you from the Barbara Bernash Baker Bio Bay Room. And we're here with Gary, who's not only a friend of Vieques, he was a resident of Vieques for many years, a professor, but also an author. And his latest book, Sustainability for the Forgotten, is something that's going to cue what we're going to talk about. Welcome, Gary.
Thank you so much, Mark.
All right, Gary, tell us a little bit about your connection to Vieques and how you came here and how was life here?
Vieques is very special. And my first trip here was in 1995, and I came visiting my professor, who had been my professor when in graduate school. I stayed with him, fell in love with the island, and have been coming back ever since, every year since 1995, learning from Vieques and the Viequense people.
Nice, nice.
I also have written most of my books while here, and for over a decade, I lived in the apartment below Barbara Baker, who this room is named for. And Barbara became like my Viequense mom. She became very special to me, like she has been to many people on Vieques. And in fact, the book that we're talking about is formally dedicated to
wow, I didn't know that part.
To Barbarita.
Yeah. Yeah, I haven't read the book, but I'm looking forward to it. And Barbarita is the way we met.
Yes.
Yes, you used to live there. And she had always this idea of fostering science by making those connections. She went to the Oslo conference and pleaded for the scientists to look at Vieques. And whenever she met people like you who were scientists, social scientists, researchers, she brought them in. And I'm happy to say that she would be very, very proud of the room we built for her and the science that she started, that we've been able to move on and continue that history of hers, and obviously the connection that you still have with us. But tell us a little bit about your life's work. You've been a professor, you've been a social scientist, you authored many books, right? And tell us a little bit about that.
I'm very fortunate in that my career has been in a series of very different stages. After I went to graduate school, I went and was a professor at the University of Idaho for a very long time, out west. And then I joined the Obama administration as science advisor to the director of the National Park Service, and moved to Washington and was part of the Obama administration for what I thought would be 4 years. But then Obama got reelected, so it became 8 years. After that period of being in politics and essentially a scientist who was a politician at the same time, working on policy, working on law, working on dealing with different elements of the political world, then I went back to being a professor at Clemson University, where I am now. Clemson took me, and I'm very grateful for that. So I left Washington. You'll like this. I had all these suits that I had to wear, in Washington. But I wasn't going to wear any more suits. Oh. So I had to think, what could I do with these suits? And I donated them to the South Carolina Department of Corrections, the prison clothing store, so when prisoners are released after doing their time, they can dress properly for interviews. Nice. And I thought it was very cool that suits that were worn by a politician in Washington became suits for ex-prisoners. I like that.
Yeah, definitely.
And so now I see my career as being an author, writing books, as well as working on a variety of projects that I think were worthwhile, all the while returning to Vieques for inspiration and guidance.
Yeah, when I like that part about returning to Vieques, because I work with you, and we have heard you conceptualize many of the things that could be done. Some have been done. And I think that it's what we're looking for in that equitative exchange of a scientist or a person who has something to offer coming here, drawing inspiration from the place, drawing the ability to write your work and your legacy, but also giving back. And I think that many times people come to Vieques and it's extraction for these sciences, for this research, rather than what you've done, which is mentor some people like me or try to conceptualize, give back, give ideas, and invest in them. So I think that's very commendable.
I think, Mark, in the book, I actually have a name to describe that responsibility. And I call it redemptive ecology. Okay. Not restoration ecology, because that is I think, a simplification. It's not that easy. You don't restore what was gone. It's always going to be different. But redemptive ecology is when people of privilege like myself have an opportunity to help right wrongs and to help deal with injustice and to help improve the lives of themselves and others and the next generation. It is a redeeming act. And so I am a firm believer in redemptive ecology as a guide to how to behave.
That's a good term. I didn't know that term.
I made it up.
Yeah,
That's
okay. That's good. Yeah, no, it goes along with the Aspire approach that I work with, which is exactly that. It's like, how do we make sure that this action of science or research or education actually matches the conservation? Because what we talked about too is we're not really coming from what used to be the shelves of the academia or the labs where like, I will bring you science, small community. Yeah. We're trying to build a community of conservation. And to do that, you have to be in there.
And my criteria is simple. If I'm going to do scientific work, it has to result in what I call usable knowledge. It has to be usable knowledge. And that isn't just that you study the right things, the important things. It's that the findings that you have can be converted to action by others and that you present it to them in such ways that they can use it, For example, and I don't think it's a digression, Mark, but if it is, I apologize.
That's right. We're here for that.
I believe that the struggle over climate change policy in the country, the scientific community did a major mistake, had a major strategic error when they decided that since they're the scientists studying climate change, they would be the ones to describe it to people, not journalists, not business persons, not local mayors, not ministers, but the scientists themselves. And what came out of that we see now is a great lack of trust and a great ignoring the criticality of climate change, right? I think we would have done much better if the scientists had delivered this information and then had other educators, inspirers, influencers, and others share that information. Scientists are not always the best at delivering their work.
Seldom
I've said
they
that
are.
much.
Yeah. No, it's the idea also that, again, the Aspire approach and something we talked about, you need somebody that can understand enough of the science because they've taken the time to look at it or they've been given the opportunity and relate it to the community. Sometimes that's a teacher, that's a field researcher, that kind of thing. And it also helps with the idea that, I agree with you, there was a lot of mistakes, I think through science, where they sit on the white coats and like, trust us, we know better, earthlings, you know. One of the things is, if they would have taken the opportunity to be side by side with fishers, farmers, and all these people who are feeling this climate change, yes, they had information before, but if they would have side by side with them, I think it would have been more effective.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we still have a chance to do that. I am hopeful that we can learn from that and that the next generation, the younger generation coming up now as activists and environmental activists, the young people are amazing. I just finished a 15 university book tour, 15 universities around the country on this book, including the University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras. And I will tell you, the young people I met on that tour are astounding. and they are inspiring to me, and I think they might have a better chance of communicating the true existential crisis of climate change and what we have to do to prepare and fix and deal with. They may do a better job than my generation. I sure hope so.
Yeah, well, I think one of the great things about scientists like you is that they leave the space to listen. As I worked with Manta and we worked with other scientists here, I noticed that the students never got to talk at one point. That's why we created Manta in such an interactive way, such an experiential way, because many times you listen to professors or scientists or teachers and they are just kind of repeating something. It's a worthy effort, but the students have something to say.
They certainly do.
And it might be a new thing. And so it's worth not just to hear, but to listen. And that's something that we like to do. I'd like to talk a little bit about a very interesting thing that I don't think many people in Vieques know. And it's that you were able to pull off something quite amazing, which was to bring in a scientific symposium to the island, which was held at the fort, right?
No, it was partially held at the fort. It was held at the Old Crow, which used to be called
the Crow's Nest.
Crow's Nest.
Yeah.
Before, long before, it was at Crow's Nest. It was, can I tell about that?
Absolutely.
So for a long time in my work, I had looked at the environmental impacts of warfare. And when I say warfare, I don't just mean battle. I mean war preparations, war training, all the way through the actual conflict to the recovery. Warfare being the entire kind of human activity and tragedy. Well, if you're looking at the environmental impacts of training, what better place to understand that than Vieques, right? And so I decided that I would bring together experts from all over the world, and what better place to bring them than Vieques? So I applied for money from NATO, their advanced research workshops for peace and security. And
Wow.
They said, why do you want to go to this little island? And I explained the whole history. And then I insisted that if I was going to use NATO money and come to Vieques, which is not that, it wasn't that many years since the bombing had stopped and the Navy had left, that I didn't want any military around. The NATO commanders, they were going to have to go somewhere else. This was just going to be civilians. They agreed. So we had this workshop of about 35 environmental scientists working on warfare from all around the world here on Vieques for 4 days. One example that was amazing. We had an environmental scientist from Kazakhstan whose job it was to remediate and fix the underground nuclear test sites that the Soviets had done.
Wow.
When they left, they simply gave him a map with some pencil dots on it that said, here's where we lit the bombs, you go fix it. Oof. So he comes, he's from Kazakhstan, he had never seen the ocean. We fly him into Vieques, and we say, okay, we're going to take you to Caracas Beach. And his first exposure to the ocean was Caracas.
How old was he?
40. He's hysterical with laughter and joy. He's just hysterical, jumping up and down. And we're going, whoa, Mukash. His name was Mukash. Whoa. We've kind of high-graded your experience here. Not all ocean is like this. You don't want to think the North Sea off Ireland is like this. And we had an amazing meeting. And the other thing I insisted to NATO is that part of the meeting would be public. As you can imagine, having a NATO science meeting on Vieques that wasn't open to the people of Vieques would be very controversial and suspicious. So we had a session at the fort, where the different speakers at the meeting would tell what we talked about. It would be very transparent. And then we'd listen to the community. And it ranged from, I remember it was Fisher, who was also a hip hop artists, to Myrna Pagan, to Bob was there, and it was a lively session. But what it was is that we wanted to show we could listen to them, and I'm very proud of the fact that it then became a book. There's a book that I co-edited called Warfare Ecology. And that it has inspired a whole generation of researchers to look at the environmental impacts of war. And it all began here on Vieques.
Wow. And let's go through some of the participants. I know they come from like very iconic places in terms of warfare. Like there were people that worked in some of the post-war areas.
In the Soviet, there weren't Soviets, but there were Eastern Europeans, there were Brits, there were Americans, and there were, we stayed away from focusing on Vieques because I wanted Vieques to sort of seep into this meeting rather than have all these other folk have to deal with it. There were people, researchers from France, there were researchers from Germany, and each day we would meet at the Crow's Nest, have our meetings, then sit and talk, and then go someplace on Vieques. We took them to the bunkers, we took them to the pier, we took them to the radar station to try to understand. We took them then eventually, of course, to the fort. And I think it was an extraordinary experience, and I can tell you, I feel strongly that it is the only NATO science workshop to be held on Vieques.
Right. Well, wow. And then you authored several books before we get to Sustainability for the Forgotten. Can you tell us a little bit about those other books?
One was called The Structure and Dynamics of Human Ecology, a model for thought and action. And if you'll notice, the first half is a really academic thing, and the second half says, well, maybe they'll deliver something useful. We don't know.
Usable.
Yeah, usable knowledge. That book was written with my professor, mostly here on Vieques, mostly at his house over in Monte Santo. And that book laid the theoretical foundation for what I was going to work on how ecology and sociology can work together to provide real action. Okay? The second book came right after I ended politics, and it was called, and left Washington, called The Future of Conservation in America. I remember that one, yes. And that was a small book written as a warning. This is what the Trump administration will do. The environmental community, you've got to get your act together, and here's how to try to improve things. Yesterday we learned the sad news that President Jimmy Carter passed away at 100. He was a good and decent man. And one of the things I'm most proud about my little book is we sent a draft to him, and he read it, and he wrote a blurb that's on the back of that little book from President Carter saying, this book's pretty good. I can't tell you how proud I am of that.
Absolutely. Like 98, right, or something? He was 98.
That would have been 2018, because it was 2017. So he was 98. He was old. Yeah. But he read it, and he made a good comment about it. I was thrilled.
Yeah,
I was thrilled.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Then I wrote a book on national parks and our nation's future. And then I started work on sustainability for the forgotten. And how I started that one is an interesting story, Mark.
All right, I'm ready. We're ready.
I'm in a small airport in a small town in Canada, getting ready to come home. I go into a small bookstore, and I pick up a small little paperback book. I bought it for less than stellar reasons. It was only $1.98, and I only had 2 loonies left.
Yeah.
It fit in my back pocket, and it was all worn, like someone else had thought it was a really good book and read it. and it had a title that was fascinating. The title of the book was Freedom to Starve.
Wow.
So I buy this book, I get on the little plane. This is a little plane that makes VAL and Cape Air look like giant, huge airlines. I mean, this was a little tiny Cessna thing. By the time I got home, I had read the whole book and dropped all my other research and said, I'm going to spend as long as it takes to write a book answering the question that this book raised. The book was written by a Catholic priest, a young priest who was sent to northeast Brazil to preach to the impoverished marginalizados of Brazil. He got there and he realized, how can I preach to a community where the children are so hungry they eat mud, and that families don't have roofs over their homes? So he forms a maids union. He brings medical supplies. He does everything that became liberation theology in the Catholic Church. He named his book Freedom to Starve because it was his argument that that's all the poor of Brazil got from independence, was the freedom to starve. That book guided me on a journey. It took 7 years to write Sustainability for the Forgotten. That means 7 times I came to Vieques and worked on it. And Barbarita would say, when are you going to finish that darn book?
Yeah.
And I had to travel to the Vatican to get a Vatican library card to go into the archives, go down in the archives and try to learn, because he wrote this book in a pseudonym, under a pseudonym, Paul Galette. That was his fake name. And I wanted to find him. After 6 months, I was unable to find him. But that book inspired the one that I wrote, Sustainability for the Forgotten.
He's still alive?
I don't know.
Oh.
And that is why one of my future books is going to be called Chasing Galette. Chasing Galette, and see if I can find him. Wow. But liberation theology in the Catholic Church was the foundation of sustainable development. It really was, because sustainable development always, all the definitions, they end with a period, should end with a comma, like it originally had, the Brundtland Report, with priority for the poor. So imagine a sustainable development goal, Mark, access to clean water for all. Doesn't that sound good?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but you can't do anything. Yeah. There's no guidance there.
Yeah. Well, and that brings me to something, because I know that, go ahead.
No, and now picture access to water, clean water for all, comma, with priority for the poor. And now you know what to do. Mm-hmm. Now you know what to tactically do first. Now you know what you need to budget for first. So liberation theology, which his book taught me, and I think was not only a guide for my book, but has made me realize that the secular conservation community needs to learn from faith-based conservation. Churches and ministers and others who believe that use faith as their guidance in conservation, to care for creation. And I think that has been ignored in the environmental community to its downfall, to its loss.
Yeah, as many things have been ignored in terms of working with the communities themselves. You know, again, that separation of the silos that never connected. You know, so sometimes it's not about destroying those silos, but connecting them to the real world, right? But it brings me to, I didn't read the book yet, but I did read some stellar reviews. And one of the reviews was, well, it was a good article, and one of the reviews talked about you focusing on policies that guided this inequality, the policies that they were just eliminating the possibility of participation of the underserved communities in sustainability and leaving it just for the elite, kind of. You talk a little bit about what your experience was with that in the government and the policies.
I do. In the book, I worked hard. My intent was to have a global perspective, to not simply focus on North America, but to have a global perspective that included the Caribbean, that included the Asia, that included Eastern Europe, that included Europe, Canada, etc. Because so many of these problems, you see them in all other places. You see them in all other places. Look at Vieques, for example, Mark. The struggle with the Navy and the bombing of Vieques, which is so formative to its self-narrative now of what Vieques is all about and what it was. That struggle was going on at the same time in Kaho'olawe in Hawaii and in the Bikini Atoll. All around that latitude of the earth, Vieques was part of a bigger struggle. And the Viequenses who were active, like yourself, knew it and interacted and worked with them. There was coordination. That same kind of link is occurring on sustainability around the world. So I wanted to really focus on not just U.S. policy, but global issues and global solutions. The first half of the book is very factual, interesting, I think, but dark, because it talks about who are the forgotten, who are the oppressed, who are the poorest of the poor around the world. How many of them are there? Where are they? What are their stories? And I worked really hard to have the voices of the forgotten in the book, where they're speaking for themselves. The second half of the book is much more hope-filled. My inspiration there was not only Galette, the priest, but Jane Goodall and her arguments for hope. But the second half, I had to pivot to, okay, what do we do? And I found the perfect inspiration in the New York City rock and roller Patti Smith.
Oh, yeah?
Patti Smith wrote, and it's in the book as an epigram starting part 2, people can redeem the work of fools. And that, to me, was, okay, now I know what I got to do. And again, redemptive ecology. People can redeem the work of fools. So the second half of the book is very practical. What are the things that we can do? And we, meaning all of us, at different levels of power and influence, all the way from a high school student to a president. What can we do to make sure the forgotten are brought into the sustainability movement? So it ends on a hopeful note from another inspirational soul, and that would be Paul Farmer, the medical doctor working in Haiti and elsewhere. And Paul Farmer and Paul Galette, the priest, had so much in common. They had all these things in common. So I was able to end the book going back to this unique priest, this amazing young man from France who had gone and written Freedom to Starve.
Wow. Well, that's almost like reading the book here, and it's very inspiring for sure. And I think it's very necessary. I think sometimes when we talk about sustainability, we don't factor that in. We just look at the nice, cool gadgets and the expensive solutions and the lifestyle, rather than to understand the reality of it.
Here's an example, Mark. Many communities brag about their sustainability, and they have metrics and measures to show that. One measure is the amount of 8 miles of bike paths, like that's sustainable. Too often, however, those bike paths simply connect one white, rich neighborhood through a park to another white, rich neighborhood. That's not sustainability for the forgotten.
Comfort.
A bike path that makes sense is a bike path that has a commuter route for service workers who have 3 jobs, including one in the middle of the night where they've got to travel and they need well-lit stuff. Here's another example. If you could invent, and out there, any young person interested in engineering and fabric, if you could invent a tent material that could have solar arrays embedded in the tent material, so refugee tents would have LED lights, you would save lives and reduce rape and assault in refugee camps, because women could safely travel from their tent to a latrine in a refugee camp, unlike what happens in so many tents, refugee camps. When they go dark, they go unsafe. So there are all kinds of things that at the start are for the elite and the privileged, but can be converted for priority for the poor and the forgotten.
Yeah, and I think many times many of these solutions are left for people who can access a bike, who can
Yes.
access the light. Lucy lights, for example, they're very useful in hurricanes and recovery, but they're very expensive.
Yes.
So how do we create not only the access, but something that the Trust is very dedicated to, which is how do you build the capacity so that these underserved are not served, but they're self-served.
Yes.
And that's something that's overlooked, because I think people underestimate the capacity of people to learn, evolve, arm themselves.
And here's a more local example. Hurricane Maria. And your work in Vieques, undoubtedly, I consider it heroic. I consider it heroic, what you, not just you, but others did. But there are technologies that we can leapfrog over. The irony is communication during Maria throughout Puerto Rico, cell towers went down. 95% of the cell towers were down. But it was ham radio and satellite radio. So it was ham radio, a technology of the 30s, and satellite radio, satellite communications, a modern technology that jumped over cell phone. Sometimes there are old solutions for new problems.
Yeah.
And I think that, again, sustainability for the forgotten is partly listening to them and how do they solve these problems? How do they solve the problems? That's why, Mark, the next book I'm working on is called Maria's Dilemma.
Oh.
And while it starts here in Puerto Rico and starts here in Vieques, it quickly, becomes an example. It's much bigger than that. Because Maria's Dilemma, in my argument, and what this book will be about, the dilemma is those that are most vulnerable are least protected, prepared, and provided for. And how do you solve that? Maria is a good example, what happened here in Puerto Rico, obviously. But all around the world, as climate change makes environmental crises and disasters more common, more severe, and more widespread, we have to solve that dilemma that the most vulnerable are the least provided for. And how do you fix that? That is not just an economic question. It is not just a political question. It is not just a strategic question. It's also a moral question. And that's what I'm going to be working on for the next few years.
Well, we appreciate it, because I think one of the things is that we learned a lot from Maria, but the storytelling sometimes falls short into understanding some of that it's a moral issue, that it's a solvable problem going forward, or enough the immorality of it is barbaric.
Yes.
If it caught us by surprise, it was wrong, but we have the tools, we have the means, we have the people. I'm glad you mentioned the ham radio, because it's a great example how Vieques did have a shortcut with less confusion. Say, oh, there is Alberic, there is the Amateur Radio Club, and we'll go straight to that. And build capacity around it. We don't personally know how to do it, but we can certainly give them resources and let them lead. And I think that's part of creating a community of conservation or a resilient community. Let the people who have been saying this lead, rather than to eat up all these ideas and try to make them your way, right?
I think Maria, and I may verge on controversy here, but Maria and the federal government's poor response, awful response, ends up being a transition tipping point for Puerto Rico and for others around the world watching how Puerto Rico reacts. And that is, I think when Trump threw towels, something clicked and said, we're on our own. We have to figure it out for ourselves. And whether it was the response to Ricky afterwards, whether it was the kinds of things being done here on Vieques to build local resilience, I get a sense, and others around the world get that sense too, that Puerto Rico is now preparing. We are on our own. We're not going to wait for FEMA. We're not going to wait for, if you remember, the first people to come to try to fix the electrical system was the Whitefish Electric Company that were friends with Secretary Zinke. It was just corrupt and grifting as could be. That's not going to happen again. And I think there's something, I don't want to give them credit, that's not what I mean, but I sense a real change as I meet with my Puerto Rican colleagues, and I sense a real learning elsewhere around the world saying, no, you don't rely on the capital. You don't rely on the federal government. You got to figure out how to be resilient by yourself. And that is a kind of decolonizing. It's a decolonizing of thought that I think leads to all kinds of benefits and strengths.
Yeah, and I think community does that individually. I think it's the answer to a lot of the resiliency and adaptation to climate change. There's so much hope in action and self-action. Like you say, if the people can do it themselves, you suddenly become a different being, free from that restraint of having to depend on everything or have to do it that particular way. They're forcing you to do it in order to get that help, in order to get that sustainability. So I think as we look at the message of conservation, sustainability, it's a lot about being able to participate in that action, to contribute to that action, to work to it. That's
now,
I think.
Remember, Mark, I'm a child of the 60s. I'm old, okay? And so I remember the Panthers, the Black Panthers.
Yeah.
I remember the Watts riots and their manifesto, the Black Panther Manifesto, that talked about power to the people. What people forget is the first two demands of the Black Panther Party in the manifesto was number one, garbage pickup, and number two, vermin control.
Well, I didn't remember that.
Because the city of Los Angeles government had decided not to pick up garbage in black neighborhoods. Then, of course, you had all the rats. And then they said, look how these people live. Their first two demands. Power to the people starts with environmental quality.
And quality of life, basically.
It is the same. Environmental quality and quality of life. How can you live a good life if you don't have a good roof, if you don't have clean water, and if you don't have a way to get rid of garbage?
There's no future in that,
I don't know whether on your podcast you've had people talking about the Black Panthers.
No, actually, this is, to be fair, this is the inaugural podcast for the trust that we're doing here with the Bio Bay Room.
Well, I hope you have many more.
Well, at least this one's really interesting to start out, and I think that's a little bit of what we want. We want a new thing coming out of the trust that brings up great ideas, realities, and ways to adapt to a changing world. But tell me about your future work. What's coming up?
One thing, I want to congratulate the trust. The VCHT, like many such trusts built around the Caribbean, often had the choice to become a kind of expatriate gringo kind of elite we care about the place that we vacation at. It could have become that. Elsewhere in the Caribbean, it is becoming that, those. But for some reason, or some leadership like your own, and others, and Lirio, and all, VCHT has become a melting pot of local concerns, local interests, and those of us privileged to visit Isla Nina. And I think that means the future for VCHT. If it stays in that broad swath where all are welcome and all are listened to, I think it's an extraordinary contribution to Vieques, and you should be really proud of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that our executive director and our president and the people who work here have really made it a sort of like a new thing. You know, it's exciting to see how people and the organizations have been able to pivot and have been able to grow in a way that keeps the community. But you're right, it had the tendency to become something else. And
so here's an old man's advice. Don't mess it up.
All right, I'll try not to. But it's a team effort, and I think sometimes I'm behind the camera and waving my arms around and screaming welcome. But there's a lot of great people who work here that have made it so. I think the idea of trying to make it so is the leaders that were there at that transition or that decision, but the employees and the volunteers are the ones, and the kids.
And one day, a young Manta will take your
place.
place.
I think I know his name.
And that will be probably one of your signature achievements.
Yes.
As a young Manta takes your place.
But then I'll go write like you.
But there we go.
What are you writing now? What's coming up?
I'm working on Maria's Dilemma, the book about humanitarian relief in the era of climate change around the world. But it's called Maria's Dilemma as it starts here. That will take several years. Right. Then I'm going to, remember I talked about the priest?
Yeah.
Then I'm going to write a book called Chasing Galette.
Yeah.
And I'm going to travel, if I have to France, where he was a young priest, to the Vatican again to try to find him, to Brazil to try to find him. And I want to chase Galette and understand this person.
What a quest.
After that, I don't know, maybe I'll write a novel.
There you go. That's amazing. And you're working now also, I know, with some of the sad situations of some of the exiled scientists. Can you tell us a little bit that as we close?
I'm a member of the National Academy of Sciences Sustainability Roundtable, okay? And with another fellow who's also Puerto Rican, he and I lead a project to work with getting scientists in dangerous zones like Ukraine, like Afghanistan, like Sudan, like Gaza, to get them to safety and their families to safety, have them continue their critical science, and then be repatriated back home when it's safe to do so. It means rescuing scientists from extraordinary, dangerous places. And while my colleague in the National Academy leads the tactical part of it, I'm helping to lead how to bring the NGOs, the non-government organizations around the world, together to better coordinate how we rescue scientists. For example, the program of the National Academy, the SEED program it's called, has probably rescued about 200 scientists from Ukraine. Mostly women scientists, because the men are serving in battle. But some of them are wheat geneticists. That intellectual property is an investment that Ukraine made that they'll desperately need back. That knowledge about growing wheat when they work to rebuild their country after the war. And so it's very rewarding. It's really complicated.
Yeah.
It's really complicated. And I think it is, again, a kind of redemptive ecology. And that's why I'm doing it.
Well, that's certainly a life's work right there, and it's saving lives. I think that's one of the most noble tasks to take.
And I am not the. I mean, there are folks like
I'm sure
with
there are.
me that are moving all these different parts to try to do this all around the world.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you're also sharing their story, which I think it's something that, as we talk to students here, when you told me, I didn't really think of it, and so it's good to share that story. So as we close, and again, glad to be here in Barbarida's room. This is actually another sad loss. We had Robert Marino, who painted this dino flagellate, and it's a little bit of his legacy, his story, with many others. But I'm, excited that we're here in Barbarida's room, because that was what brought us together originally. Excited that this is the first, so I'm hoping you continue to come right.
Thank you.
And come talk to us again.
You're
the first. We always be the first podcaster here.
And if you want to read the book,
absolutely,
you can buy it online.
Where can we get it?
I have an author's website.
Okay.
That is just www.gemachlis.com.
Okay.
So it's www.gemachlis.com, and on there you can click and get to be able to order the book directly from the publishers.
Okay.
Here's one additional thing to consider if you buy the book. All the royalties that would normally go to me go to Paul Farmer's Partners in Health that is working in Haiti.
Wow.
And that's because, Mark, I didn't see a way that I could spend 7 years writing about the issues of the forgotten and the poor and then make money off it. So the royalties, such as they are, go to Paul Farmer's Partners in Health.
They're certainly needed there, yeah. Wow. Gary, thank you.
Thank you.
All right. And stay, attend to our podcast. Pedro Ayala runs the show. You're not seeing him behind the camera, but we'll be coming to you with different people, interesting people like Gary, people who care about Vieques, friends of Vieques, with stories to tell.